Hi. Stand up nation. No hat today. I just I just didn't have the time to get all done up for you guys. So I'm going no hat. You have to deal with it. Um okay, so where did we leave off here video wise? Jim Jefferies, the Thunder from down under. I don't know. Um just finished going through your comments. Um and again, I can't tell if you guys really like these comedians or if you're just like, you know, acting like you do because it's a class. Um, but I hope you do enjoy them. That would be an added perk of the course if you actually enjoyed this stuff. Wouldn't isn't that a novel idea? Enjoying the content that you're studying in your college courses. Um, so Jim Jeffries has had a really interesting, for those of you who weren't in class um, last week, um, he's the gun control bits, as I mentioned in the description, really kind of put him on the map. They went viral in 2016 and kind of changed his whole trajectory professionally, but he fell into this new, it's kind of the new comedy model. Um, and I think it's a great model considering the old model. The old model was, and we've talked about this in class. The old model was become a comedian, right? Do stand up, go on, you know, do clubs all over the country, and hopefully get noticed by a TV producer or something, or some a TV executive, and turn your stand up into a sitcom and then have the sitcom be a hit and then become a movie star and then, you know, or get on SNL. Like that was the trajectory, which is good, but as you can see, it doesn't necessarily emphasize good stand up. As stand up is the first step toward these other things. But now, and Louis C.K. kind of changed this. Like Louis was, turned his comedy into a show, but it wasn't his own. It was completely his own doing. So he took stand up and turned it into an opportunity to have complete creative control and be able to do what he wanted to do, not what a studio wanted to do. Um, and he directs and he writes and he edits like all the episodes of his TV show and like all these kinds of things. So for a while there, all these comedians were going to their agents and saying, "I want the Louis C.K. deal," which is like you can't do all those things. Like you don't just say you want that. But even since Louis, I think Jim Jeffries embodies kind of where this is going. Hassan Minhaj sort of has it too. Like you do stand up to be able to say more, not be able to say less by getting on a network sitcom where they completely control everything, every idea you have, but to get to a point where you can really speak your opinions. So like John Oliver did the Daily Show and then did stand up, then Daily Show, then um, last week tonight Hassan Minhaj, same thing, daily stand up, Daily Show, Patriot Act. Um, Jeffries kind of followed that path too. Stand up. Then he had his own show on Comedy Central. I think it was called like the Jim Jeffries Show, but it was similar to like um, a Daily Show type thing. It was like a half hour, and he'd do like a monologue type thing, and he'd have guests, and he'd do sketches and stuff like that. And now he does a podcast that is a really interesting concept at, I think, the front end of where good comedy is going, which is it's called I don't know about that. And he brings in like a special guest who's a specialist in something that Jim Jefferies doesn't know about. And they have this conversation about that thing. And it's this at once this funny commentary and literally actively learning about, something new. So the entertained and enlightened uh, concept that I laid out early in the semester, right? That comedy is this search for truth and the exploration of ideas other than your own and opinions and perspectives that can really only help us in the long run, you know? So it's clear that he's invested in, right, comedy as a portal into uh, learning or meaning or understanding or, whatever. Kind of like what, who said that? Lydia, maybe? Yeah. Comedians that educate and entertain. Um, so that's kind of his arc, and he's done a bunch of specials on Netflix, and um, there's kind of a bunch of you connected into the shock comedy genre, right? But that he does it in a more evolved way. Like if he's a descendant of Bill Hicks, not Andrew Dice Clay, right? He kind of made that connection. Well done. So my notes on Jim Jefferies are kind of all over the place. So I apologize for that. Um, but one of the things that kind of um, came to mind watching him this time was this idea that when logic starts to sound crazy or funny or like hilarious, we're in trouble. And that's what the whole Trump administration was about. Was about completely dismantling the truth and making it sort of elusive, like who's telling the truth and things like that. But when Trump became president, and the one was, um, what was the one thing, like when you put a premium on logic and reason and rational thought, and it really starts to turn, and the rational start to sound crazy, if that makes any sense. That's a dangerous position. We were teetering on that with Trump. Trump's whole sort of misdirection with truth and information was an attempt to sort of keep the country in a state of um, tentativity. I just made that word up. Um, but like, him speaking logically about gun control shouldn't be as funny as it is, right? So, right, like that kind of, he taps into that mentality. He's like, what I'm saying isn't funny. It's 100% logical. But when the culture sort of twists that around and you feel like the logical is funny or ridiculous or crazy or whatever, then no, then we're fucked. So I think he plays with that a lot, right? And he, with the gun control bit specifically, he even says it. He's like, I'm, I'm, I'm just I'm done with the bullshit arguments. Like you, I agree with the right to own firearms. I agree with it, but the arguments you're building this on are false. They're just not accurate, right? It's like you can say you want a lot of guns. Like why is everyone afraid to say that? You hide behind these sort of bullshit platitudes and things like that. And this Second Amendment, when you know that's all bullshit. Like let's be real about this stuff at least. And when are real about these kinds of things, you start to dig at the real reasons behind our gun obsession. And it's not to protect your family. It's usually because you're afraid, you're insecure, like, and these are sort of you know the symptoms of mental health issues. If you really want to call it what it is. Um, but he's like, I'm done with the bullshit arguments. Like, just stop. You're not fooling anybody, right? Um, we talked about it in class, like how he breaks down the room or his audiences or whoever's watching. 50% of you agree with me, 50% of you don't. Like, that's just America is a 50-50 proposition, it seems like, for some reason, right? And then of those 50 that disagree, 20% are kind of, you know, whatever. There's another 20%, then there's that 10% that are just want to murder him, you know. So he has that comedian's, you know, self awareness that has developed over the last like 20 years or so of comedy, stand up comedy. That self awareness and kind of putting himself into a larger context, basically, and I think addressing those people. Like I think that's an interesting tactic, um, for sure. Um, his whole bit about having to play down to the dumbest 1%, right? And how that's how we legislate, except with guns. And this ties into um, like his examples, like you can't take drugs because whoever took a bunch of drugs and like murdered her family or something, like, so now no more drugs, but not you right up to guns, and then we stop that mentality. Um, and that takes me to Logan's comment about rights and privileges, right? It's back to the Carlin bit about we don't have rights. You have a bunch of privileges. And if you believe that, he Carlin goes through and explains like everybody has a Bill of Rights. Every democratic country, every free country, and so they all have different numbers and different rights in general. So how could those be God given? Like that whole thing is like you don't have rights. They're privileges and they can be taken away. You know, just ask Japanese Americans in the 40s, 50s. Um, right. So if you believe that we don't have rights based on the structure of the Constitution and its relationship to God given, like all that stuff, that they are just privileges. Well, privileges are earned, right? Rights are given, privileges are earned, and we we should have lost our privilege to have guns a long time ago, right? Because constantly we should be legislating down to the 1% of people who, completely misuse or abuse them. And it's kind of what he was saying about the Australian reaction to the mass shooting. It's like, all right, you you had guns. This dickhead ruined it for everybody, basically. Shot up all these people. Like, oh, all right, you've proven you can't be responsible enough as a nation, so we're going to take him away. And boom. Um, so yeah, I think he works with some really interesting ideas, and he doesn't just come out and give you this kind of standard anti-gun or um, anti-gun argument. Like he's saying if you can't, if I'm asking you not to use bullshit arguments, I shouldn't be allowed to either. Um, yeah, we you have to play to the 1% of idiots. That's a slippery slope with the general public because it's like if you've seen the movie Idiocracy, right? That's basically the premise is that we just keep getting dumber and dumber, and and then you end up being, this sort of dystopia. And I mean, I teach that movie in my one of my other classes, and one of the paper topics is always, is idiocracy plausible? Like, it's hard to say that it's not plausible after, especially after watching the devolution of this country in the last, you know, the last 5 to 10 years, socially, um, politically, economically, like all that stuff. Um, and that's what Jefferies kind of talks about. I love the bit about Trump and about you can't beat hate with hate. It just doesn't work. Only love can beat hate. And being the asshole, like that little anecdote he tells, the person that you hate the most, just start being nice to them. You don't have to like them or anything, just start being nice to them. Eventually, like, you might not be friends, you might not turn it around or whatever, but everyone's going to look at the two of you and say, he's the asshole. Like, don't be the asshole, basically. And I love that. Like, that whole, the whole don't be the asshole. But so many of us are being the asshole. And I'm not just saying that against, toward conservatives only. Like, now we have the extreme left and the extreme right are basically being the assholes. Um, and it's just, I think that don't be the asshole is a great slogan. Um, and it seems like, yeah, it could apply to the teachings of Jesus, basically, if you want to go tie it back to religion. Didn't Jeffrey say the Bible should be one page? It's like, don't be an asshole, basically. Try to be good. Try to be a nice person. Whatever it is, don't be a dick. Um, yes, I did write down Carlin's Bill of Rights bit. Should go back and watch that and connect it to all this stuff that Jeffries is talking about. There's some interesting parallels um, there. I wrote down, what do we do with our freedom? That whole, that the angle that he takes, that we're the least free country in the world, right? Was an interesting, if not sort of cute, way to make a point, about freedom and how the illusion of it, how we're sort of we're sort of snowed by this, land of the free, home of the brave, and all the, propping up the flag and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all this other, the First and Second Amendments. Um, but what do we do with that? seems like we reduce any sort of type of freedom we have down to the lowest common denominator, like we do with our legislation and things like that, and just um, take it for granted, use it to separate and distance ourselves from other people who should share the same rights. Um, and again, I think he's really introspective. I think he's self-aware in a way that, more comedians are now than were 15, 20 years ago for sure. Um, but I think he brings some of that 90s, early 90s, late 80s aesthetic too, that like the Bill Hicks type of thing, um, which is, obviously good. um, um, I don't know if I mentioned this in class. Yeah, I did. I think it was one of the paper things. Comedians made me rethink everything that I was taught growing up about religion and government and all those kind of things that you don't really think about as a kid or even as a teenager. Um, and then, because I heard one thing from my family, my parents, my school, my friends, whatever, and whatever media I was watching. And then I started watching comedians who were like contradicting a lot of it. And you look into it and you're like, oh shit, what about that? What about this? And I think that's a function of comedy that too few people acknowledge or appreciate. Um, but especially religion was the big one that comedy really steered me into a different direction, put me through that process of belief, as I've talked about before. Um, he says questions are cancer to religion, right? The last thing they want is you asking questions about why these things exist and why you have to do this and why that and well, what about this and what about that and explain kangaroos, right? Like that whole thing. Yeah, questions are like cancer to religion, and it's no surprise that the conservative movement since Bush really, and probably before that, I just don't know enough about politics before that, but um, put a premium on education and, you know, not put a premium on. They were anti-education, basically, was right, because an educated public is a more difficult, it is a less easily manipulated one, right? Um, so slashing education and, the attack on the the coastal elites or the intellectualism, just the concept of intellectualism and seeking truth and asking questions, like those are antithetical to a conservative movement that wants to go back to the 1950s, how America, MAGA, who wants to do that. Like, um, those things don't really go together. Um, we're a pick and choose culture. I'm getting into the religion stuff now, where a bunch of you mentioned, like, he was so angry. And I'm like, who said it the most? Alex. I was like, he came off as really angry. And it wasn't just Alex, but it was a bunch of people in class and here. And I just read it, I heard it enough that I'm like, so what? Like, would you rather him not be, like, moved to talk about these things and upset enough to sort of weigh in? Like, I always interpret anger on stage as passion, for whatever you know, whatever that's worth to you. except in the case of someone like, as I mentioned before in class, Lewis Black, who makes anger like a shtick. If it makes any sense, like if I sense that it's genuine anger, right, and it's not premeditated. It's not like, oh, I need to yell this part. That's what Lewis Black does. There's clear parts in his act wherever his, yeah, in his notes, he's like, scream this. Here's where I get heated. Like that. That's I think that's pretty uh, shitty. But if a comedian's on stage and like Bill Hicks was like this, like he would get really fired up and almost go like it would take him to places that he wasn't planning on going. To me, that's passion, and you know, I'll take that over just going through the motions and um, like I want my comedians a little bit angry, especially if they're talking about shit that matters. Um, and I think he does a good job of that, right? And his religion stuff, like you know, we've talked about this with other comedians. Like they kind of have to do their homework, or else they look like idiots. Increasingly nowadays, I think they're doing more research when they're writing jokes and putting bits together. So like he's clearly read um, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens' opinions about organized religion and things like that. He clearly read the Bible, like the just that statistic, or understands the Bible, right, enough to be able to talk about it. Because I think comedians, more so than probably most people, are like, you know what, if I'm going to talk about this, I want to know about it. Whereas politicians might go out and just fucking say whatever the fuck they want and not know anything about it. Um, but the Bible, that statistic, like the shrimp thing is mentioned 8 times and the gay thing is mentioned twice. So he cares more about you not eating shrimp than, yeah. uh, so winding down, there's this idea. He gives off this whole thing like I wrote this. He's not here for you, the audience, right? He's here to give his thoughts and opinions. What you do with them is up to you. Whether you agree with him is up to you. Can you be honest enough with yourself to listen to what he has to say and process it and maybe change your mind? I don't know. That's not on him. Um, and I think that's a great way to do it. If you're gonna do the kind of comedy that he does, like he's like, no, I'm not here. I'm not here for you. I'm here for me. Um, I think that's good. So comment wise, Evan. Evan used. I just like the way he phrased it. Like, fine. He's on the line between comedy and controversy, right? I think that's an interesting way to put what Jim Jefferies does. Because yeah, I guess what he's saying is controversial. Like, but is it? That's another thing we have to sort of dissect. Is like his gun control stuff. Is it controversial? Yeah. How can logic be controversial? That's back to my original point. It's like when logic becomes controversial, like we're fucked. When rational thought becomes controversial, and right now in our culture, we frequently misconstrue those two things, right? Or yeah, confuse them for the one or the other. Um, Logan, I mentioned Logan's point about, or at least I don't know if he said this, but he was in reading his comment. I was thinking about Carlin's bit about rights and privileges and how they're really not rights, they're privileges. So I outlined that. But Logan said something like a successful comedian is able to bring their perspective with clarity and impact, like which is that's a good way to put it. Um, what good are you in any situation, not just a comedic situation, but as a teacher or a boss or a I don't know, whatever. What good are you if you can't relay your perspective with clarity and impact? You're no good, you know. So then Joe, comedy no longer about saying whatever you have to for a laugh. Yeah, that's a good one. That's not what you said, but that was my take on your comment, Joe. Um, these comedians aren't looking for laughs in the traditional sense, right? The old comedy adage was, whatever you got to do to make them laugh. Well, that's kind of shitty. Like, in that case, you're just a fucking clown, right? It's like, dance for me, monkey. Like, make me, right, entertain me. I think comedy, when it's really good, like in Jim Jefferies' case, is like, he's not saying anything for you. That's back to my whole, he's not up there for you. Um, he's saying what he wants to say, and if you laugh, like there's a whole range of reactions that comedians enjoy. Laughter, sort of that gasp, right? Thought, like all these kinds of things. He even says like laughter's, you know, it's down the list. I want to make you sort of, I want to shake you a little bit. I mentioned Lydia about educate and entertain. Um, what else is in here? Uh, Tyler, the irony of American ideals. Ah, that just hit me. Hit me funny. Not funny. I shouldn't say funny. That just hit me. It piqued my interest. Um, and yeah, he talks a lot about the irony of American ideals and how a lot of times we contradict ourselves. Yeah, like all that stuff that Jim Jefferies was talking about was just like there's what everybody says and how everybody acts, and then there's the reality of the situation. Um, and Kathleen and a bunch of you mentioned this idea of like, well, it's great to me because I agree with what he's saying, like, and that is something that is a gulf that comedy has to sort of span at some point. Is like, what about people who disagree with him or with whatever these comedians are saying? Are they honest enough to listen to it? Like I was saying before, many cases it's not. Like the message needs to get to everybody, not just the people who already agree with you. Um, and then Jules talked about trying to remove the emotion from, like, it seems like we need to do that more as a culture, like remove the emotion from these arguments, just sort of, again, get back to logic and reason. And until we can strip away the emotion and, all that kind of stuff, we're kind of stuck. Um, and yeah, I talked about Alex's comment. Like, so what if he's angry? I'd rather him be angry than sort of than indifferent, right? So there's that. I'll see you guys. I'll see a bunch of you soon.